Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we are opening a file that has been cold for nearly 8 decades, but it remains just white hot in the American imagination. We are talking about the sources surrounding one of the most famous and I think one of the most chilling unsolved murders in U.S. history. This is the case that really it defined the dark underbelly of a city that was promising endless glamour.
Okay, so let's unpack this. We have to set the stage. We're in Los Angeles, 1947.
Right.
And this is not the LA you think of today. It's a boom town, fresh out of the war. It's swelling with ambition, with military personnel, people just pouring in, chasing that Hollywood starlight.
Intoxicating scent of opportunity, yeah.
But just lurking right beneath that glossy surface.
Yeah.
You had broken promises, rampant post-war crime, and this rising tide of social instability.
And our sources paint a really stark picture of this. It's a city of contrasts.
Dazzling light and terrifying dark, and it was about to be tragically illuminated by one single horrific event. What's so fascinating here is how quickly this particular crime, it just transcended the typical police blotter report.
Yeah.
It became an instant urban legend.
Right.
So today, we're diving into the sources around the brutal, unsolved murder of Elizabeth Short. A name that is, tragically, it's completely overshadowed by the terrifying moniker the press gave her almost immediately.
The Black Dahlia.
Precisely. And our core mission today, as we go through these sources, is to really get beyond the myth. The myth the media created.
Yeah.
We need to unpack the terrifying documented facts of the case. And we're going to focus not just on the sheer brutality, which shocked the nation, but also on the lasting legacy that defines this case. And that legacy is, for 70-plus years, no conviction, no clear suspect, and no final answer.
It's unbelievable.
And this profound inability to solve the case, despite the massive resources they threw at it, that's as crucial to the story as the murder itself.
Yeah.
It tells you something deeply unsettling about the killer.
It's a profound failure of justice, and it's a lasting trauma in the public consciousness, exactly because the answers have just remained out of reach. So let's jump right into the sources. Let's establish that initial shock. We're going to go back to the moment the whole world changed for a young woman named Elizabeth Short and how that moment was first perceived.
Okay, so the date is January 15th, 1947. The setting is a vacant lot near the corner of 39th Street and Norton Avenue in Los Angeles. And it's important to understand this location. It wasn't, some remote ravine or an industrial wasteland. This was a residential area.
A place where kids played, where neighbors walked their dogs.
Exactly.
And the sources, they detail this truly horrifying but almost surreal moment of discovery. A local resident, a woman named Betty Bersinger, she's just taking a routine walk with her 3-year-old child, and she notices something strange in the grass. Two starkly white sections of a human body placed almost symmetrically.
And that initial perception is absolutely crucial to understanding the killer's psychology here.
What she thought it was.
Yes. The witness thought it was a discarded store mannequin. Just think about that for a moment. To mistake human remains for, a plastic display. It suggests a horrifying degree of calculation.
Of control.
Complete control over the scene. The sources tell us the body was not only cut perfectly in half at the waist, but it was also meticulously cleaned and positioned.
So that initial deception, mistaking life for plastic, it just sets this chilling theatrical tone for the entire investigation, doesn't it?
It does.
It signals right away that the killer's intention wasn't just to, get rid of a body. It was to make a deliberate, dramatic statement. What does that tell you about their intent? Public perception versus the actual investigation.
It reveals a profound confidence and a strong element of performance. If the killer wanted to simply hide the body, they failed spectacularly.
Right.
But if they wanted to stage a spectacle that would draw maximum public attention and, crucially, initially confuse law enforcement and witnesses, well, they succeeded perfectly.
So the staging wasn't an accident?
Not at all.
Yeah.
It was designed to maximize shock value while delaying positive identification and complicating that initial scene analysis.
But it wasn't plastic. It was the remains of a young woman who pretty quickly became identified.
It was Elizabeth Short. She was only 22 years old. And the physical facts reported immediately, they gave the investigators their first critical piece of context, even before they understood the full scope of the crime.
Right. Through her fingerprints. That was the method.
Exactly. The most reliable forensic method they had at the time.
And then there's that crucial physical detail, which the sources highlight as immediately apparent to the first officers on the scene. The complete almost surgical lack of blood at the dumping site.
Exactly. This is the linchpin. This is the linchpin of the entire logistical analysis of the crime. If a body is violently dismembered and dumped, there should be an enormous pool of blood. We're talking 5 liters or more.
And there was nothing.
The sources are clear. There was virtually no blood at the vacant lot. This led to the immediate and critical inference that she was killed and critically systematically processed somewhere else entirely.
So the murder site, the location of the actual crime, was never that vacant lot. It was, and still is, completely unknown.
Right.
And that complicates everything from the get-go, because the primary crime scene itself, where you would find forensic evidence like fibers, trace elements, blood spatter, it was erased before the police even knew a murder had occurred.
The killer essentially neutralized the best investigative tool the police had.
That's the key.
It is. If you connect this to the bigger picture, the killer demonstrated this extraordinary level of control, not just over the victim, but over the post-mortem logistics and the disposal. I mean, to stage a body in broad daylight in a residential vacant lot, having done something so brutal somewhere else, that implies immense confidence, planning, and access to a controlled private space.
A level of control that just gets more and more disturbing when we look closer at the specifics of the physical crime itself. And here is where the analytical focus has to pivot. We have to look at the anatomical details that the sources provide, because the brutality went so far beyond just the act of murder. It was about mutilation, display, and a kind of clinical precision.
Let's focus on that precision, because the source material highlights 2 staggering facts about the state of the body.
Yeah.
And both required specialized knowledge and, resources. Key fact 1, the body was cut perfectly in half at the waist. Key fact 2, the body was completely drained of blood.
I want to spend a moment on that bisection. To cut a human body perfectly in half, severing the lumbar spine, the muscle, the tissue, with that kind of clinical precision, that suggests a high level of anatomical knowledge, doesn't it?
It does. The documentation of the bisection is crucial. This wasn't a crude, violent hack job. The cuts were described as clean. Yeah, indicating a sharp, long instrument was used, probably a blade or some kind of surgical saw. And importantly, to achieve that level of separation, specifically separating the torso at the 3rd and 4th lumbar vertebrae, that requires not just strength, but an intimate understanding of where the joints and bones meet minimal resistance.
So someone who knew what they were doing.
Someone who had done this kind of work before, or the very least had studied anatomy intensely.
And this demands technical skill in a non-hasty, sterile environment, which brings us to the blood drainage.
Right.
The human body holds, 5 to 6 liters of blood? Removing all of it isn't a fast process.
Absolutely not. The blood drainage is maybe the single most damning piece of forensic evidence pointing toward a calculated profile. This process is highly time-consuming. It requires a controlled environment, likely indoors, with access to running water or large vessels, and drainage.
A bathtub or a large sink.
Or even a professional setting, yeah. The sources suggest the body may have been suspended upside down or positioned to let gravity assist the process, which further implies a specific physical setup.
This means the killer had time. A lot of time. They weren't rushing. They had a remote controlled location where they could meticulously perform this horrific process, completely undisturbed, over hours.
Indeed. They controlled the environment to such an extent that they could remove virtually all physical evidence that might have connected the crime back to them. This logistical mastery, it argues so vehemently against a disorganized killer or a crime of passion committed by an amateur in a panic.
No, this was premeditated.
Absolutely. The meticulous nature suggests premeditation, planning, and it points toward a specific, professionalized profile of a killer, which, we'll explore when we get to the theories.
But the physical wounds weren't just functional, were they? Like the bisection and blood drainage, which seemed designed to defeat forensics. Some of them were also deeply symbolic and psychological, intended for the public gaze, which brings us to her face.
Yes, the facial mutilation. The sources detail a feature that truly horrified the public. These deep, precise cuts, running from the corners of her mouth, extending across the cheeks, all the way to her ears.
That ghastly forced smile.
That detail was later dubbed the Glasgow smile, or the Joker smile, a term referencing similar historical mutilations.
And this isn't about efficiency.
No, this is about psychological messaging. The bisection and blood drainage, they speak to a technical mastery designed to evade police. The facial mutilation, that speaks directly to the public and to the victim's identity, a young woman who came to Hollywood to smile for the camera.
It implies this perverse desire to inflict suffering and create a grotesque mask. It's that theatrical element you mentioned earlier.
This single detail adds a calculated, almost ritualistic layer to the brutality beyond just the killing itself. The killer was actively performing. They transformed Elizabeth Short into a piece of horrifying performance art, ensuring maximum psychological impact and making the crime just unforgettable.
And the media, whether they meant to or not, became the eager audience for that performance almost instantly, didn't they?
They did. The combination of the crime's dramatic visuals, the mannequin confusion, the surgical precision, the signature smile, and the media's hunger for sensation, it immediately elevated this case above the thousands of other violent crimes in post-war LA.
The transformation of the victim began instantly. Elizabeth Short, the aspiring actress, was gone.
And in her place, the newspapers gave her a sensationalized, unforgettable new name, referencing a contemporary film noir, the Black Dahlia.
That naming convention, fueled by the stark visuals of the crime, it immediately set the stage for decades of myth. It stopped being a tragedy about a specific young woman, and it started being a horror story about a legend.
And that transformation, that elevation above a typical murder report, meant that the investigation was conducted under a spotlight of unprecedented, almost suffocating intensity.
Which, ironically, probably hindered good, quiet, methodical police work.
It almost always does.
We've established the horrific crime scene and that signature brutality. But to really understand the case, we have to pivot from the scene to the life of the woman who became its victim, who was Elizabeth Short beneath the dark nickname. The sources give us this quick, almost heartbreaking profile of an aspiring young woman in post-war Hollywood.
Elizabeth Short was born in Massachusetts, and she arrived in California chasing the sun and the movies. That dream of fame, of making it big, it was the driving force for so many young people who flocked to LA during that era.
It's the classic American narrative, isn't it? Seeking transformation, escaping a mundane past.
But the sources quickly and very powerfully counterbalance that hopeful dream with the unstable, transient reality of her life in California.
Yeah, she was not famous. She wasn't even on the brink of fame. Her life was defined by fragility, impermanence. She was drifting.
We see a clear pattern of instability based on the documented accounts from her friends and acquaintances. She had no steady job.
She was a waitress sometimes.
Briefly. But the income was sporadic. And crucially, she moved constantly from place to place, often relying on temporary boyfriends, soldiers, or brief acquaintances for shelter. She was perpetually rootless in a city that demands you prove your stability.
Can you give us a bit more detail on that transience? I mean, why was she unable to settle down?
Well, her instability was compounded by her relationship history. The sources indicate she frequently associated with military personnel, particularly those at nearby bases like Camp Pendleton. She'd been married briefly and unhappily before the war, and after her husband died in action, she continued to gravitate toward servicemen.
It offered a brief sense of security, I imagine.
Validation, yes.
Yeah.
But it contributed to her constant movement, following men as they moved or being forced to move when those relationships ended.
And how did the people who knew her perceive her? The sources note that friends described her as quiet and lonely, which, given the life she was leading, suggests a deeply internal vulnerability.
This is critical. A quiet, lonely person who is constantly seeking a temporary place to stay or a ride or companionship lacks that critical safety net that stable residency and steady employment provide.
And what did her acquaintances say?
They described her as friendly but guarded. She rarely shared deep personal details, which made her hard to track but also prevented her from forming those deep protective bonds.
That profile of instability and loneliness is just crucial because it speaks directly to vulnerability.
It does.
A lonely person, constantly moving, lacking a steady social anchor, she might be more susceptible to the advances of strangers or rely entirely on the perceived kindness of acquaintances.
Which can be a fatal error when you encounter a predator.
Exactly. When you are quiet, lonely, and moving from place to place, your discernment might be compromised by the simple desire for shelter or companionship or connection.
This is background detail. It shifts the focus away from a purely random encounter and strongly towards the possibility of someone who exploited her precarious, desperate situation, someone who offered her what she desperately needed.
And it connects directly to one of the later theories of who the killer might have been, a trusted individual, someone who noticed that vulnerability and just capitalized on it.
Furthermore, her constant movement complicates the timeline leading up to the murder. The sources place her in San Diego in early January 1947, and then she traveled to Los Angeles. The final, known confirmed sighting was around January 9th, where she was reportedly dropped off at the Biltmore Hotel downtown.
So we have a gap of roughly 6 days from January 9th to the discovery on the 15th, where she effectively disappeared.
Hmm.
A disappearance that, unlike those of stable, well-connected individuals, might not have been immediately noticed or reported with the same urgency given her transient lifestyle.
And the general chaos of post-war LA, yeah.
That gap between the instability of her life and the shocking discovery is the window of true horror.
The moment the body was identified and the nature of the mutilation became public knowledge, the entire landscape of the case just shifted away from quiet police procedure. This was no longer just a homicide investigation. It instantly became a massive, unprecedented media spectacle.
The sources state it simply and accurately. The media went crazy. This wasn't standard reporting. This was a frenzy designed to sell papers in a highly competitive market. You had this intense rivalry between the big newspaper chains.
This media escalation is a crucial historical context point. In 1947, the press held immense power and operated with almost zero, journalistic oversight or ethical restraint regarding crime reporting.
The key facts here are deeply shocking by modern standards.
They are. Newspapers published graphic, unedited photos of the crime scene and the victim's body.
And worse, private details of Elizabeth's life, her relationships, her aspirations, her family history were often exaggerated, twisted, or just completely fabricated.
Right. To fit the narrative of the Black Dahlia, the party girl who met a bad end, they transformed her into a marketable caricature.
And this is a critical factor in the case failure, isn't it? The press essentially seized control of the narrative.
They did. They were focusing less on finding the truth and more on building a compelling, terrifying myth. The sensationalism fueled the public imagination, creating a climate of fear, but it actively contaminated the investigation by blurring the lines between fact and fiction.
So the police are chasing leads from journalistic rumors instead of verified evidence.
Exactly.
And this is precisely where the killer's reaction becomes paramount. The sources clearly observed that the killer seemed to enjoy the attention. They seemed to enjoy the chaos that the media spectacle created. This detail is fundamental because it suggests a calculated, ego-driven element to the crime. It confirms the initial staging wasn't an accident.
No, it was intended for an audience and designed to generate this exact level of frenzy. The killer wasn't hiding in the shadows, hoping to evade detection. The killer was interacting with the spectacle they had created.
And that interaction took the form of direct communication with the press, not the police.
Letters and packages arrived soon after the discovery. This was a deliberate attempt to assert ownership over the crime and the narrative.
And the genius, or the horror, of the killer's method here was proving authenticity in a way that guaranteed maximum media distribution.
Right. The sources detail the contents of these letters and packages. Elizabeth's highly specific, intimate documents. We're talking about her birth certificate, photos, and critically, her address book.
Why those specific items? What's fascinating here is what sending these personal documents achieved beyond just confirming the killer's involvement.
Well, they serve multiple high-level psychological functions. First, it immediately shut down any doubt that the letters were genuine. Only the killer could have had possession of those intimate documents. It confirmed their access to her in the days leading up to the murder.
Right. And second, the act asserted absolute control over the narrative. By communicating directly with the newspapers, the killer just bypassed the police entirely.
They ensured their voice and their chosen facts. The spectacle of the crime reached the public, unfiltered and instantly amplified across the nation.
And third, that address book. That's a power play, isn't it?
Oh, it's a huge power play. The address book contained the names and contacts of everyone Elizabeth Short knew. By sending it to the press, the killer effectively put the police investigation into a chaotic tailspin.
Suddenly, every name in that book is a suspect, a lead, a potential victim.
You're overwhelming investigators with irrelevant information. The killer was generating noise to obscure the signal.
And the message itself was just so clear it was a boast. I killed the Black Dahlia. This act deepened the psychological torment, not just for the public and the investigators, but it transformed the act of murder into a deliberate public contest of wills. The killer was challenging the police to catch them while simultaneously reveling in the chaos they had manufactured.
And it fundamentally shifts the motive away from a simple, singular rage against Elizabeth Short. If the killer is enjoying the spectacle and communicating through the media, their primary desire might not have been simply to end her life, but to achieve maximum, enduring recognition for the act of creating the Black Dahlia legend.
So the media didn't just report on the crime.
No, they were actively manipulated into being the killer's ultimate co-conspirator in the creation of the myth.
With the media fueling the fire and the killer actively taunting them, the pressure on the LAPD and the DA's office must have been immense.
It was. And our sources detail the sheer scope of the investigation that followed, but also the structural weaknesses inherent to 1947 law enforcement.
The scope was certainly immense.
Oh, it was huge. Police investigated more than 150 official suspects and hundreds of other persons of interest. I mean, just think about that volume. Over 150 individuals who came under serious, prolonged scrutiny.
Many of whom were completely innocent. They just had the misfortune of knowing her or being in the wrong place at the wrong time.
And this wasn't a narrow suspect pool either. The sources show the wide-ranging professions and statuses of the suspects. Doctors, actors, strangers, people confessing for attention, and actual credible leads.
You're chasing everyone.
They had to. It was because of public pressure and the lack of a clear forensic direction. The sheer number reflects the desperation. They were relying almost exclusively on interviews, tips, and circumstantial connections, rather than hard physical evidence.
Which brings us to the critical gaps in the evidence and the limitations of the time period. Let's elaborate on those limitations. When you and I look at this case today, the lack of modern forensic tools seems like an almost insurmountable barrier.
It truly was. In 1947, the tools they had were primitive compared to today's capabilities. Specifically, the critical missing factors were devastating. No DNA analysis existed. That is the cornerstone of modern cold case solving. DNA could have tied the killer to the victim's body or clothing, but that technology was decades away.
So what were they relying on instead, and why was it so inadequate here?
Well, they relied heavily on fingerprint analysis, which was quite good even then, but you needed a physical print to match to a known suspect.
Right.
They had early ballistics, which was irrelevant. No gun was used. Toxicology was crude, mainly testing for common poisons. And crucially, fiber analysis and microscopic trace evidence recovery were extremely rudimentary and not standardized.
So the chance of matching a fiber from the vacant lot to a suspect's car or home was basically zero.
Slim to none. And you have to remember the contamination caused by the sheer number of police and media swarming that vacant lot. Even if it wasn't the primary crime scene, it must have destroyed any fragile trace evidence that might have been there.
So the chaos of the investigation just made the forensic challenges even worse.
Yes. But we have to connect back to that initial finding, the lack of a known killing location. Since the body was drained of blood somewhere else, the police had no primary crime scene to search for critical evidence.
Which means they couldn't search for a murder weapon, a struggle, blood spatter patterns.
Or witnesses who saw the struggle itself.
Yeah.
Exactly. The lack of a primary crime scene compounded the difficulty of finding any physical evidence. They lacked the central hub of the crime.
The killer's meticulous planning, draining the body, cleaning it, staging it remotely, it was the ultimate counterforensic tactic.
They used the logistics of the crime to preemptively dismantle the investigation's chances of success by making the case entirely deductive and circumstantial.
And on top of all that, you have this constant stream of false confessions, driven by the intense media focus.
It wasted countless man-hours. In the years following the murder, dozens of people, suffering from mental instability or just seeking notoriety, confessed to being the Black Dahlia killer.
And back then, proving a confession false often required extensive police work, didn't it?
It did, which further drained resources that should have been spent building a case against actual suspects. The investigation became an exercise in chasing ghosts and rumors because the physical trail was systematically erased before the discovery.
The killer understood the limitations of 1940s police work and exploited them perfectly.
So, since the investigation stalled due to the lack of hard evidence and the strategic erasure of the primary crime scene, the legacy of the Black Dahlia case rests entirely on the theories developed over the years. And our sources distill these theories into two compelling yet chilling profiles about the killer's identity and motivation.
Okay, theory one. This one focuses entirely on the physical state of the body and the technical difficulty of the crime.
The calculated professional.
The evidence supporting this is based directly on the state of the body, which we've already discussed. The sources note the cuts were described as precise, clean, and professional.
This precision immediately implies the killer had specialized anatomical knowledge. The clean bisection and the methodical blood drainage, they strongly suggest a medical background. The implication is that the killer was not an amateur driven by blind rage, but someone trained to use surgical tools effectively on human tissue.
So we have to ask the questions posed by the source material. Could it have been a surgeon, or maybe someone trained specifically to cut and process bodies?
The analysis has to consider both medical training and anatomical processing. A surgeon is the most common suggestion because they possess that acute knowledge of anatomy and the ability to work cleanly under pressure.
But other professions can't be ruled out, right?
No, not at all. A mortician or an embalmer who handles bodies post-mortem, or even a highly skilled butcher who understands the separation of large joints. The sources, though, they lean toward someone with comprehensive knowledge of the human body's internal structure, specifically the skeletal joints, which makes that medical background so compelling.
So if this theory is correct, it speaks to a highly calculated act. Maybe a test of skill or a perverse demonstration of technical power, totally devoid of emotional connection to the victim. The crime is the performance of competence.
Exactly. The professional killer is characterized by logistical efficiency and detachment. Their goal was to commit a perfect crime, forensic-wise, and the brutality was simply a calculated step in that process.
But then we have to pivot dramatically to theory two, the intimate betrayal. And this theory isn't based on how the murder was committed, but rather how the killer gained access to Elizabeth Short and why she didn't seem to struggle.
The core premise here is that the killer was someone Elizabeth trusted. Given her unstable lifestyle, her vulnerability, and the fact that there were no signs of a struggle at the dump site, it implies she was likely incapacitated or compliant before the mutilation began.
So she must have gone willingly to the location where she was murdered.
The implication is clear. This was someone who invited her in to the location of the murder, someone she did not fear.
Given her transient nature, this could have been a new boyfriend, an acquaintance who offered her a place to stay.
Or someone promising her a connection to her Hollywood dream.
Yes.
This theory relies entirely on the human element and the psychology of exploitation. The killer didn't have to overpower her physically to get her to that initial crime location. They used trust, charm, comfort, or manipulation.
Methods employed by predators who seek out vulnerable, transient individuals.
This suggests an individual capable of charming or gaining the confidence of a lonely, rootless young woman, perhaps offering temporary security before the final ultimate betrayal.
It provides a horrifying counterpoint to the idea of the cold, clinical professional, doesn't it? The intimate killer is manipulative, exploiting emotional needs rather than physical strength.
And this leads to the central tension of the case. Did the killer use professional skill theory 1 or intimate access theory 2? The facts of the case demand an analysis of both.
Which is where the sources force us to contemplate the most disturbing scenario of all, a combination of both. Imagine a killer who possessed both high professional, anatomical skill and used a veneer of trust to lure the victim into their controlled environment.
That combination creates the ultimate untraceable killer, someone who is precise, calculated, and also intimately known to the victim. And if we adopt this combined theory, the calculated brutality takes on a new psychological layer.
Huh.
Well, if the killer was intimately known to Elizabeth Short, the excessive performative brutality and staging might have been designed to intentionally obscure a personal, messy motive.
By making the crime look like the work of a serial killer or a complete stranger.
Exactly, diverting suspicion away from the trust relationship.
That thought that the killer was someone trusted who then engaged in such theatrical, clinical violence, that is often the most disturbing element of this case, because it shatters the illusion of safety and reminds you that predators often look exactly like the people we invite into our lives.
It's the ultimate act of deception, both toward the victim and toward the investigating police force.
As we conclude this deep dive into the source material surrounding Elizabeth Short, the Black Dahlia, the tragic irony of her life and death just stands out so vividly.
She never achieved the fame she sought in life. She came to Hollywood seeking that spotlight, that recognition, and it tragically eluded her during her 22 years.
But in death, she became a legend, a symbol of Hollywood's dark side, a cautionary tale, and a perpetual reminder that the dreams this city sells are sometimes fatally fragile.
The crime became a cultural touchstone that persists nearly 8 decades later.
The sources, despite their historical limitations, deliver a clear, unsettling portrait of a meticulously planned and executed crime that capitalized on a volatile moment in history, the instability of the post-war era, and the rapacious appetite of the media.
The killer was not just successful in murder, but successful in crafting a myth that law enforcement was powerless to stop.
So we're left with the 3 fundamental analytical questions posed by the source material, questions that police, historians, and true crime aficionados have wrestled with for 80 years. And we leave these with you, the listener, to consider based on the extensive evidence we've just unpacked.